Diana and Leona have a very complicated history, both in the universe of League and in real life. They are two characters that, despite initially having very little to do with each other, are more or less joined at the hip now. It's sort of impossible to talk about one without discussing the other, so today we're going to do something a little different and try covering both characters in one video. There's a lot to go over, so let's jump right in. Leona was released July 13th, 2011. In her original backstory, she was a member of the Rakor tribe, which was basically Runeterra's equivalent to the Spartans. Keep in mind that in the old lore, Targon was effectively just a mountain. We hadn't yet established all the cosmic lore and space stuff that defines the region nowadays. That being said, the Rakor were still established to be a people that revered the sun, with its priests making up an order called the Solari. The Rakor as a whole, though, also had a thing for battle. Again, Spartans. And so they trained all their able-bodied young in the way of combat. Though skilled, Leona never cared much for her people's warfaring ways, preferring to fight only in defense of those she cared about. When Leona refused to partake in ritualistic combat that would lead to the loser's death, it was ordered that she be executed, considering this a forfeit to both the match and her life. Just as Leona was about to perish, however, the sun itself suddenly intervened, unleashing a burst of light that incapacitated Leona's executioners. This was never really explained in the old canon. It's not clear if the sun was actually a god or if Leona just had some latent sunlight magic. But either way, she was taken in by the Solari priests and made into their champion. Thus, Leona was able to take up arms on her own terms as the chosen of the sun, fighting in defense of her people and never spilling blood needlessly. A year later, on August 7th, 2012, Diana would be introduced to the game. Also born to the sun-worshipping Rakor, Diana found herself far more intrigued with the moon than the sun. This was, of course, seen as heresy, and Diana's reverence of the moon earned her the repeated scolding and punishments from her elders, as well as the resentment of her peers. Regardless, she still sought to prove that her faith in the moon was genuine, and that eventually led Diana to discovering an ancient temple dedicated to a long-dead religion that worshipped the lunar light. In it, Diana found a ceremonial blade as well as some silver lunari armor, and tried to present both to her people. It went about as well as you'd expect. Like Leona, she was bound to face execution, and was likewise saved by a burst of moonlight from her deity. Tired of trying to reason with the Solari, Diana declared that they were the true heretics and set about trying to rebuild the Lunari faith. Thus, Diana and Leona became rivals, champions for opposing religions that view one another as heretics. It was an interesting dynamic, to be sure. While Leona was never outright stated to despise moon worship like so many of her Solari kin, given that Diana specifically stated that her mission was to banish the sun and kill all of its worshippers, it makes sense that Leona would stand in opposition to her. Thus, we had the dynamic established. Two opposing, overzealous cults determined to prove that their god was the one true light of Runeterra. We still didn't really know for sure if the sun and moon of the old Runeterra were actually sentient, let alone divine, but that hardly mattered. The rivalry was a strong one, and presented a rather interesting dynamic. Then the Great Retcon happened, and Riot decided to turn Diana and Leona into star-crossed lovers. Let's clear this up now. I'm not really opposed to this idea, but I think the execution is somewhat lacking. Okay, so here's a basic synopsis of their new shared story. Diana was an orphan found and raised by the Solari, but she found herself ostracized because she was always questioning their teachings. The one person who didn't reject her was Leona, a Solari girl that found herself drawn to this inquisitive child. The two spent many nights together wrapped in heated debate, and though they were never able to reach mutual ground and understanding, a fast friendship formed between them, which of course turned into something more over time. Eventually, Diana discovered an abandoned temple, depicting warriors of the sun and moon standing together on Targon's slopes. Diana tried to share this news with Leona, but the Solari girl was less than enthused, insisting that Diana forget about these ruins. Ultimately, Diana did the only thing she could think of: search the most sacred place on all of Targon for proof that worshipping the moon was not heresy: the sacred peak. Diana climbed all the way to the top, unaware of the fact that Leona was following her. When both women reached the peak, they were engulfed in pillars of silver and gold. Diana and Leona had been chosen as vessels for the aspects of the sun and moon, who are now much more clearly stated to be actual deities, or just really powerful spirits if you've seen my theory video on the subject. Regardless, though they now had proof that both deities coexisted, Diana and Leona still couldn't quite see eye to eye. Leona wanted to return to the Solari elders and present their findings, but Diana had another objective: find the remnants of the Lunari faith and rebuild the moon cult. The two argue, then fight, but Diana ultimately flees before they wind up killing each other. Diana then decides, strangely enough, that she's going to speak with the Solari elders after all, alone. It doesn't go well. They proclaim her a heretic and try to kill her, so just as in the old lore, Diana slays them in self-defense. Leona then returns to find a bunch of Solari elders dead, which certainly doesn't paint a good picture of her old companion, and vows to find Diana in the hopes of bringing her back to the sunlight, whatever the cost. Diana, though, only wants to build a future where the Solari and Lunari can coexist, as they supposedly had long ago. Okay, so, overall, I don't think this version of the lore is awful exactly. My biggest issue is that the current canon pretty much puts Diana completely in the right, which I think messes with the dynamic severely. While the Lunari and Diana in particular have always been oppressed by the Solari, even in the old lore, Diana's fanaticism was arguably just as bad as those she condemns. Now, I know Riot tends to get a lot of flack for both siding their political conflicts, and rightfully so, but this is the one instance where I think it really could have worked. Instead, we now have Diana and the Lunari pleading for peace and coexistence with the Solari, and the Sun Worshippers just dismiss them all as heretics, capturing and executing them for daring to worship the moon. Even Leona, who is meant to be portrayed as the more reasonable one among her people, wants to convert Diana back to the sun faith. Never mind that Diana literally has the moon goddess living in her head now. Like, the story seems confused about what it wants to do with them. Are they lovers turned enemies who've fallen out of love with each other because they're more devoted to their respective faiths? Or are they quietly pining for one another while destiny keeps them apart? If it's the latter, we know that's BS because there is literally no reason for them to fight. The universe is practically screaming at these two that the Solari and Lunari can coexist, even turning another random pair of star-crossed lovers into a constellation just to get that point across. Diana has wholeheartedly accepted this fact, and it's just Leona being weirdly stubborn about denying all the evidence right in front of her because even though she's not as close-minded as the rest of her people, she still just can't accept it for some reason. If it's the former, and Leona and Diana are officially exes, well, Riot sure as hell seems to be promoting the pairing in spite of that. The two try to kill each other nearly every time they meet, but they're always together during Pride Month artwork. It also doesn't help that Diana's voice lines in-game continue to paint her as someone that wants to kill the Solari faith outright, and all who worship it, despite that no longer really being who she is. There's also a couple of godly elephants in the room to address, those being the Golden and Silver Sisters, aka the aspects that Leona and Diana embody. According to Legends of Runeterra, the reason why the Solari and Lunari are fighting is because these goddesses have something of a beef with each other. From the heavens, two beings came. One was robed in silver's glow, the other clad in golden flame. Though both were formed of cosmic light, they fought, for they were two alike. And so these two split night from day, so each could always have their way. In other words, it's the sisters themselves who don't want to coexist, and thus their followers are pitted against each other in cyclical violence, despite the fact that the Lunari want to coexist. Or maybe not, because the moon goddess made Aphelios into an assassin for killing Solari elders? Honestly, it's still weird to me that he's painted as a Lunari chosen one, even though Diana is their aspect. Yeah, this whole thing has gotten rather convoluted. As much as I love Targon's lore and all the space god stuff they have going on, the war between the Solari and the Lunari is easily the most mishandled aspect of the region. No pun intended. The Lunari flip-flop from being this oppressed minority who are forced to fight for their right to coexist, like the mages in Demacia, to an equally fanatic cult that believe moon worship is the only valid religion and the sun's light blinds and deceives. The story can't quite seem to decide if Leona and Diana are bitter enemies or reluctant adversaries who feel forced to fight because of fate, even though those two are probably in the best positions of anyone to end the conflict. I mean, maybe you can argue that their gods are forcing them to fight, but Diana and Leona don't seem to have been possessed by their aspects like Atreus was with Pantheon. So it seems more like a stubborn refusal to actually try and find any sort of compromise. So, on that note, allow me to offer my own take on how this story could have been handled. As before, Diana uncovers ancient Lunari ruins, but will remove the mural that showed them and the Solari standing side by side. She and Leona can continue their relationship until the latter is suddenly chosen as the aspect of the sun. Maybe while defending a Rakoran child or something? Either way, this is where the rift between them starts to grow. Maybe Leona has visions of some ancient conflict in which the Lunari attacked the Solari, which led to the sun worshippers striking back and crushing the worshipping of the moon entirely. Diana, not quite pleased with this explanation, scales Targon alone and arrives at its peak in hopes of finding the truth there. Under the full light of the moon, Diana is also chosen as an aspect, and receives a vision that shows the same thing as Leona, but from a different perspective. The Solari descending on Lunari towns and temples, mercilessly slaughtering what seemed to be a peaceful people. Diana, enraged, seeks out Leona and the two argue over their visions, which leads to them fighting. As before, the clash ends in a draw before Diana retreats. She sets out to spread the word of the Lunari faith and rebuild it from the ground up, while Leona must prepare the Solari for the coming conflict. The kicker is that both sides are operating on incomplete information. The truth behind the ancient clash between Solari and Lunari could in fact be that they were tricked into attacking each other. By who? Well, we do know of an aspect that has a penchant for mischief. one that isn't afraid to use deception or immoral tactics to instigate the change that it represents. Who better to be the true antagonist in this war between day and night than the aspect of Twilight, who tricked the Golden and Silver Sisters into starting this cyclical conflict? This puts Diana and Leona at odds, but sets up potential for future plot lines in which the truth is revealed, and the aspects of the sun and moon are able to reconcile, perhaps even rebuild their relationship when all is said and done. Or alternatively, we could have them forced to set aside their differences to fight back a void invasion or something, if we wanted to go a simpler route with it. But that's just how I would handle the matter. What do you all think? Should Diana and Leona be enemies or lovers? Do you think the Solari-Lunari conflict is fine as is, or is it a little too one-sided? Leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I'll see you all next time.